In 2008, a neuroscientist in Berlin put people inside an fMRI scanner and gave them the simplest possible task. Press a button, left hand or right hand, whenever you feel like it. Just remember what letter was on the clock when you made your choice. That's it. What John Dylan Haynes found should have been front-page news on every paper on Earth. He could predict which hand they'd choose with 60% accuracy, up to 10 seconds before they pressed the button. 10 seconds before the person thought they had decided. The brain had already made the choice. The conscious mind was just informed later. That wasn't the first time someone found this. Benjamin Libet found it in 1983. He measured a brain signal called the readiness potential, a build-up of electrical activity in the motor cortex, that appeared 550 milliseconds before people reported feeling the urge to move. Half a second before you felt the decision, your brain had already started executing it. Now, here's what follows from that. If your brain decides before you do, who exactly is doing the deciding? And if something other than your conscious self is running the show, what happens when outside forces learn to talk directly to that something? That's what this is about. The human brain has roughly 86 billion neurons. Each one connects to thousands of others. The total number of possible neural connections exceeds the estimated number of atoms in the observable universe, and almost none of it runs consciously. Neuroscientists estimate the unconscious brain processes around 11 million bits of information per second. The conscious mind handles about 40 to 50. That is not a typo. 11 million versus 50. So when you walk into a room and something feels wrong before you can say why, that's not intuition in any mystical sense. That's your brain completing calculations you don't have access to. When you feel drawn to a person before you've said a word, your brain has already processed their micro-expressions, their posture, the pitch of their voice, the way they hold their hands, and 100 other inputs. It has run all of that through pattern recognition built from decades of experience and delivered you a verdict. The feeling arrives before the reasoning does. This is what psychologist Daniel Kahneman spent 4 decades studying. He called it System 1 and System 2. System 1 is automatic, fast, and always running. It recognizes your mother's face in a crowd. It finishes the pattern before you've finished looking. It drives your car home while your mind is somewhere else entirely. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and costs energy. It does long division. It reads a legal contract, it second guesses. Here's the problem. System 1 is wrong constantly. It's fast because it takes shortcuts. And those shortcuts, what scientists call heuristics, can be hijacked. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman demonstrated this in 1974. They spun a wheel of fortune in front of participants, a wheel rigged to stop at either 10 or 65. Then they asked a completely unrelated question. What percentage of African nations are in the United Nations? The wheel had nothing to do with the question. It was purely random. But people who saw 65 guessed an average of 45%. People who saw 10 guessed an average of 25%. A spinning wheel moved the answer to a factual question by 20 percentage points. This is called anchoring, and it works on doctors, lawyers, federal judges, and tenured professors just as well as it works on everyone else. In 2006, a study in the Journal of Legal Studies found that judges who read a case file with a randomly generated prison sentence embedded in it recommended longer sentences than judges who read the same case with a shorter random number. The number was fake, planted there deliberately. It still moved them. So, your brain runs mostly on autopilot. It takes shortcuts. It gets moved by inputs it doesn't notice. That is the baseline. Now, meet the people who found out how to use it. In 1913, John B. Watson was the most respected behavioral psychologist in the United States. Then a scandal destroyed his academic career. An affair with a graduate student, and he left academia entirely. He went to work at J. Walter Thompson, one of the largest advertising agencies in New York City, and he brought everything he knew about behavior with him. Watson believed you didn't need to understand what people thought. You only needed to control what they felt, get the emotion right, and the behavior follows. He'd read Pavlov's experiments on conditioned responses in dogs and asked quietly, what happens if you do that to a consumer? Before Watson, advertisements mostly listed what a product did. After Watson, ads told you who you would be if you bought it, or who you would become if you didn't. Johnson & Johnson's baby powder campaigns in the 1920s didn't talk about talc. They talked about whether you were a good mother. That is not an accident. That is a man who understood that buying decisions are mostly emotional, and that emotions run faster than logic. But Watson was an amateur compared to what came next. Edward Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He read his uncle's work on the unconscious and decided to use it commercially. In 1929, the tobacco industry had a problem. Women didn't smoke in public. It was considered socially unacceptable. That was half the market entirely untouched. Bernays hired women, suffragette types, visible and confident, to march in the New York Easter Parade and light cigarettes at a prearranged signal. He tipped off journalists in advance. He called the cigarettes torches of freedom. The photographs ran in papers across the country. Within a year, women smoking in public had become normal. He changed nothing about the product. He changed what the product meant. Bernays called this the engineering of consent. He wrote a book with that exact title in 1947. He wasn't hiding it. He genuinely believed it was a public service. The rational management of mass behavior by people who understood psychology better than the masses did. That's what he believed, and the techniques he built are still taught in every marketing program on Earth. So what are those techniques specifically? The first is mere exposure. In 1968, psychologist Robert Zayonk ran experiments where he showed people geometric shapes, nonsense words, and photographs of strangers, some dozens of times, some only once. He then asked which they preferred. They consistently preferred the ones they'd seen more, even when they didn't remember seeing them. Familiarity alone produces liking. No reasoning involved, no awareness. This is why political campaigns plaster names on lawn signs across a district even when the signs say nothing. The name on enough street corners is worth more than any policy position. It's why jingles work. You don't need to like the jingle. Repetition does the rest. The second is priming. In 1996, John Bargh at Yale ran an experiment where one group of students completed a word task that included terms like Florida, forgetful, bald, and wrinkle. A control group got neutral words. After the task, he measured how fast they walked down a hallway. The group exposed to elderly associated words walked measurably slower. They weren't told anything about old age. They showed no awareness of any influence. Their physical behavior still changed. The implications for design, advertising, and political messaging are enormous. Warm colors in a restaurant make people linger longer and order more. Heavier clipboards make job applicants seem more substantial and serious to interviewers. In a study out of the University of Leicester in 1999, classical music playing in a wine shop caused customers to buy bottles that cost on average 3 times more than when pop music played instead. The environment is speaking to your brain constantly, and your brain is responding, and you are not in that conversation. The third technique is social proof. Milgram, better known for his obedience experiments, ran a different study in 1969 on a sidewalk in New York City. He had one person stop and stare at the sky. He measured how many passers-by also stopped. 4%. He then had 5 people stare up together. 80% of passers-by stopped. Nothing changed about what was up there. Only the number of people looking. This scales into every domain imaginable. Hotels that place signs reading, "Most guests in this room reuse their towels," get significantly higher reuse rates than hotels that simply ask guests to conserve water. Amazon's frequently bought together is that. The fake laugh track on a 1970s sitcom is that. The restaurant that labels 3 items most popular is that. Your sense of what's normal behavior is partly a live calculation based on what you observe other people doing. Your brain does this automatically, without asking your permission, because for most of human history, watching what everyone else does was an extremely reliable guide to what was safe. Now we reach something harder. You might think you're fine. You don't buy impulsively. You check your sources. You're skeptical. Here's what the research says about skeptical people. Confirmation bias is not a flaw in unintelligent people. It is a default operation in all human cognition. You seek out information that confirms what you already think. You read sources that agree with you. You remember evidence that supports your position and quietly forget evidence that doesn't. A 1979 Stanford study, one of the most replicated in social psychology, gave participants who either supported or opposed capital punishment 2 fake research studies. One study supported capital punishment, one challenged it. Both were described as methodologically flawed. Both groups rated the study that confirmed their prior position as more rigorous. Both groups came out of the experiment holding their original position more firmly than before. They read identical information. They became more polarized, not less. That was 1979. It has replicated across dozens of subsequent studies. In 2010, Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler at Dartmouth documented something they called the backfire effect. When people with strong political beliefs were shown factual corrections to false beliefs they held, they sometimes reinforced their original positions rather than updating them. That specific paper has had replication difficulties. Later researchers found the backfire effect is less consistent than Nyhan originally reported. But a core version of the finding has held. Presenting facts to someone who is emotionally invested in a belief often doesn't work. Sometimes it makes things worse. Why? Because belief isn't stored in the rational part of your brain. It's stored in your identity. If your political affiliation, your religion, your community, your sense of who you are, if any of that is tied to a factual claim, then evidence against the claim is functionally a threat against you. And your brain processes social threats the same way it processes physical ones. Brain imaging studies confirm this. The amygdala, the region that handles fear and threat responses, activates when someone challenges a deeply held belief. Your brain treats a contrary fact the same way it treats a snarling dog. In 2013, a team at Cambridge published a study using Facebook likes. They collected 58,000 volunteers' likes and compared them against personality assessments. From likes alone, just the pages and posts people had clicked, they could predict sexual orientation correctly 88% of the time for men. Ethnicity with 95% accuracy. Whether someone's parents divorced before the person turned 21. Whether they used drugs. Their intelligence scores. Their political affiliation with 85% accuracy. The people providing likes had no idea they were communicating any of this. They thought they were clicking on football teams and television shows. That study became the foundation for something larger. In 2016, a company called Cambridge Analytica claimed it had built psychographic profiles of 87 million Americans using harvested Facebook data and could target political advertising calibrated to manipulate specific personality types. Whether Cambridge Analytica changed the 2016 election is genuinely contested among researchers. Their methods were almost certainly overstated in their own marketing. But here's what was not overstated. Facebook held that data. The profiles existed. They were real. And Facebook's own internal research, published in a 2012 paper in the journal PNAS, demonstrated that by adjusting what 689,000 users saw in their feeds without telling them, the platform measurably changed their emotional states. Users who saw more positive content produced more positive posts. Users who saw more negative content did the same. The researchers called it an emotional contagion study. They ran it without informing the users. The recommendation algorithm on YouTube was redesigned in 2016, not primarily for information quality or user satisfaction, but for a metric called watch time. Keep people watching as long as possible. The algorithm found something quickly. Content that maximized watch time was usually content that was slightly more extreme than whatever the viewer had just watched. A video about nutrition led to clean eating content, then raw food movements, then prolonged fasting. Then, if the viewer kept following the recommendations, content that was clinically dangerous. A 2018 New York Times investigation traced the same escalation in political content. Viewers who watch mainstream conservative material were progressively served content from the far right. Viewers who watched mainstream progressive content were served increasingly radical content in the other direction. The algorithm wasn't designed to radicalize anyone. It was optimizing for watch time. Extreme content just happened to generate the most of it. The outcome was the same regardless of intent. Eli Pariser named this in his 2011 book, The Filter Bubble. Your online environment is not a neutral window onto reality. It is a personalized chamber constructed from your previous behavior. Google's search results for the identical query look different depending on who is asking. Facebook's feed prioritizes content from people you interact with, which means you see less from people you disagree with. Not because you blocked them, but because you never clicked on their posts. Your information environment narrows over time. You don't notice it happening. It feels like you're reading the news. You're reading your version of the news. That distinction matters enormously, and almost nobody feels it. Now add one more mechanism, the illusory truth effect. In 1977, Lynn Hasher, David Goldstein, and Thomas Topino published a study showing that people rated statements as more likely to be true if they had heard them before, even when the statements had been labeled false the first time they heard them. Heard it before. Felt familiar. Familiar feels true. This was replicated in 2015 by Lisa Fazio at Vanderbilt, who showed that even people who already knew the correct answer rated familiar incorrect statements as more believable on second exposure. Knowing the truth does not make you immune. Political operatives have known this principle for decades, whether or not they could cite the academic paper. Repeat a claim. Repeat it again. Repetition builds a form of credibility that has nothing to do with accuracy. According to a Washington Post tally, Donald Trump repeated the phrase fake news more than 2,000 times in his first year in office alone. Whatever you think of the politics as a psychological technique, the repetition is precise. The mirror image is equally precise. Say something false often enough, in enough places, from enough different mouths, and it begins to feel like it might be true. Journalists who work in misinformation correction have documented this problem since at least 2014. The word for it is the illusory truth effect. The people using it don't need to know the word. In 1951, Solomon Asch put a single subject in a room with 7 other people, all secretly working with him. The task was simple. Match a line on a card to the obviously correct line on another card. The answer was visible to anyone with functioning eyes. The Confederates, Asch's accomplices, all gave the wrong answer out loud. 75% of subjects went along with the wrong answer at least once. Only 25% never caved. When subjects were later asked to explain, many said they had genuinely started to doubt their own eyes. Not social pressure alone, actual perceptual doubt. The surrounding consensus had overridden what they were seeing. This isn't weakness. It's your brain running a rational calculation from the wrong premises. If 7 people see something different from what I see, maybe I'm the one who's wrong. Throughout most of human history, in most real-world situations, that logic would be correct. In Ash's lab, it was catastrophically wrong. The 7 were lying. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments from 1961 to 1963 are the most famous study in psychology. But the version most people know is simplified. The setup: subjects were told to administer electric shocks to another person, actually an actor, whenever that person answered a question incorrectly. The shocks escalated up to 450 volts. The actor screamed, begged for them to stop, and eventually went silent. An authority figure in a white lab coat simply said, "Please continue." 65% of participants administered the maximum shock. But what people miss is this. Milgram ran 18 variations. When the authority figure gave orders over the phone instead of in person, compliance dropped to 20%. When the subject could see the person being shocked rather than only hearing them, compliance dropped further. When other people in the room refused to continue, peer refusal, not authority, compliance dropped to 10%. The physical presence of authority mattered. The visibility of the victim mattered. And the presence of other resistors mattered most of all. Milgram wasn't studying cruelty. He was studying the mechanics of how ordinary social structures produce obedience. Every workplace, every government, every institution, every religion uses these mechanics. Not always deliberately, but they work the same way regardless of intent. Now take all of that and put it inside a social media platform. Likes, shares, comments, follow accounts. They're not neutral features. They're a real-time social pressure system. A study published in Science in 2018, Soroush Vasogi, Deb Roy, and Sinan Aral at MIT analyzed the spread of true and false news stories on Twitter from 2006 to 2017. That's 126,000 stories shared by 3 million people over a decade. False news traveled faster, farther and deeper than true news. Not slightly faster, 6 times faster on average. When the researchers controlled for bots and automated accounts, the advantage of false news remained. The bots were not the main driver. People were. People shared false news more because it was more novel, more surprising, more emotionally activating. Your brain is drawn to novelty as a survival feature. New things might be threats, might be opportunities, might be critical information. You pay attention to them automatically. False information that surprises you hits that detection system hard. Accurate information that describes a complex, slow-moving reality is usually boring. We need to talk about fear specifically, not anxiety, not worry. Fear. Fear shuts down the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-term planning, evidence evaluation, and weighing consequences. When you're genuinely afraid, you don't think, you react. And what you react toward is usually the option that promises the fastest safety, offered by whoever appears most visibly in charge. This is not a flaw. It is the oldest feature of human cognition. If a lion is charging, you don't want to deliberate. Your brain evolved to prioritize survival over reflection. But the same neurological system that saved your ancestors from predators is accessible to anyone who wants you to stop thinking. The behavioral inhibition system, the BIS, activates under threat and literally narrows your cognition. Attention collapses to the perceived threat. Thinking narrows to immediate solutions. Social trust contracts toward people who look, think, and live like you. Distrust of outsiders rises automatically. A 2003 paper by John Jost at NYU found that when people are reminded of their own mortality, a mechanism called terror management, they show increased preference for authoritarian leaders and increased hostility toward outgroups. Think carefully about what reliably reminds people of their mortality. A news cycle that leads every night with death and destruction does it. A political candidate who describes a civilization in apocalyptic terms does it. A religious doctrine centered on salvation and damnation does it. None of those sources are necessarily doing it cynically. The cognitive outcome is the same regardless. Fear makes you easier to lead. Joseph Goebbels, Nazi Germany's Minister of Propaganda, wrote in his private diary in 1942, "Propaganda must present only that aspect of the truth which is favorable to its own side." He had studied American advertising specifically. He found it useful. What worked in Germany in the 1930s was not unique to Germany or to the 1930s. The techniques were simple messages repeated constantly, dehumanization of defined enemies, sustained cultivation of fear and threat, a clearly defined us and an unmistakably defined them, a leader who embodied the answer to the fear. Every step of that sequence maps directly onto documented cognitive vulnerabilities. The dehumanization step is particularly well studied. A 2011 study from Princeton showed that when people are shown images of homeless individuals or drug addicts, the medial prefrontal cortex, the region most active when you think of other people as having full inner lives, activates significantly less than when viewing any other social group. Less empathy, less mental effort to imagine their experience. Language accelerates this transformation faster than most people believe is possible. In Rwanda, Tutsi people were described on national radio as inyenzi, cockroaches, for months before the 1994 genocide began. The radio played that language daily. When the killing started in April, it spread with a speed that required the prior months of psychological preparation to be intelligible. The words didn't cause the genocide, but they made the genocide possible. Not all influence operates through fear or deception. Some of it is built by people who genuinely believe they are helping. Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein wrote Nudge in 2008 and argued that the way choices are presented, what they call choice architecture, determines outcomes independent of the actual options being offered. The clearest example, organ donation. In Germany, you must actively opt in to be a registered donor. About 12% of people are registered. In Austria, you are automatically registered and must actively opt out if you don't want to be. About 99% of people are registered. Same general culture. Neighbouring countries. Different default. The default setting of a choice has more impact on what most people choose than almost any amount of information, persuasion, or financial incentive. This has been used well. Multiple countries have shifted retirement savings programs to automatic enrollment. Opt out if you don't want to participate, rather than opt in if you do. Savings rates climb significantly without anyone being forced to do anything. It has also been used badly. Software terms of service agreements that run to 30 pages and require a click of agree before you can proceed. Subscription services built so that cancelling requires a phone call and signing up requires 2 clicks. Interfaces designed to make certain choices invisible. The privacy setting buried 6 menus deep. The data sharing agreement pre-checked. These are called dark patterns. UX designer Harry Brignall coined the term in 2010 and began cataloguing them systematically. They are not accidents of bad design. They are the design. Defaults operate deeper than button placement. In 2009, behavioral economist Dan Ariely presented research on what happens when surveys offer a don't know or undecided option. People take it, even when they have actual views. Phone surveys that include a neutral midpoint, neither agree nor disagree, produce measurably more neutral responses than the same survey without one. The escape hatch changes what gets measured. What looks like a measurement of opinion is partly a measurement of how the survey was structured. Political polling, market research, medical consent forms, ballot design. All of these are shaped by design choices made by people the respondents never see and whose interests are not always aligned with accurate measurement. In 2017, Tristan Harris, a former design ethicist at Google, testified before a Senate committee and said something that sounds simple but carries significant weight. He said, "There's 1 million people on the other side of the screen whose job is to get you to pick up the phone and not put it down." That's not rhetoric. Every major platform, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, X, employs teams of engineers, behavioral scientists and product designers whose specific job is to study how the human brain works and design systems that override your intention to stop using the platform. They found the mechanism in B.F. Skinner's work from the 1950s. Skinner showed that the most powerful pattern for reinforcing behavior is not constant reward, not random reward, but intermittent, unpredictable reward. A lever that pays out sometimes, on a schedule you can't predict, produces behavior that is more persistent and more resistant to extinction than any other schedule. This is what makes slot machines work. The gambler doesn't expect every pull to pay. They expect that one of the pulls will, they don't know which one. Scrolling a social media feed is a slot machine. Most posts are unremarkable, but occasionally a message from someone you care about, a video that makes you laugh, a piece of news that shocks you. You don't know which scroll delivers it. The uncertainty is the mechanism. Sean Parker, one of Facebook's founding presidents, said this in 2017 with unusual candor at an Axios event. How do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible? It's a social validation feedback loop, exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. He said this, on the record, with his name attached. The average American adult spent 4 hours and 37 minutes per day on their phone, according to 2021 data from App Annie, a third of waking life. Unlike most things people spend that much time on, it often doesn't leave them refreshed. In 2018, researchers at the University of Pennsylvania took 143 undergraduates and randomly assigned one group to limit their Facebook, Instagram and Snapchat use to 10 minutes per platform per day for 3 weeks. The other group used those platforms normally. The limited group showed significant reductions in loneliness and depression. The study was small, but the direction has replicated. Here is the most uncomfortable detail. Many of the designers who built these systems won't allow their own children to use the products they made. Steve Jobs didn't let his children use iPads. Chris Anderson, former editor of Wired, told the New York Times in 2014 that he enforced strict screen limits for his 5 children at home. His reason: we've seen what technology does and we don't want it in our kids' lives. These are not people who built something they believed was harmless and got unlucky. They knew what the products were designed to do. Here is something worth being precise about. Your political views are less the product of information and reasoning than they are the product of the following: your birth order, the political orientation of the town you grew up in, whether you were raised religious and which religion, your score on the personality trait called openness to experience, and the median political affiliation of your 5 closest friends. None of these are absolute determinants. All of them are significant predictors. A 2014 study in the journal Behavioral Brain Research found measurable structural differences in the brains of self-identified conservatives and liberals. Conservatives showed larger amygdala on average, the region associated with threat detection and fear response. Liberals showed more grey matter in the anterior cingulate cortex, associated with tolerating uncertainty and processing competing information. This does not map onto intelligence. Neither group scores higher on cognitive ability measures. What it maps onto is sensitivity to threat and sensitivity to novelty. And both of those are predictable targets for specific kinds of influence. If you're biologically more sensitive to threat, media that amplifies threat captures more of your attention and produces stronger emotional responses. If you're more sensitive to novelty and complexity, media that offers constant reframing and nuanced uncertainty holds your engagement longer. Neither side is immune. The vulnerabilities just look different from the outside. The concept of manufacturing consent comes from Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's 1988 book of that name. Their argument was structural, not conspiratorial. Major media organizations are not controlled by shadowy cabals. They're controlled by market forces. Media companies need advertising revenue. Advertisers want audiences with money. Wealthy audiences have certain political and economic interests. Coverage that challenges those interests puts revenue at risk. No conspiracy is required. No single person needs to make a cynical editorial decision. The system self-selects for certain stories and certain framings, and self-selects against others through financial pressure operating at a distance. A journalist who files stories that create friction with major advertisers will find over time that those stories are less likely to air. Not because of a phone call from the advertiser, because their editor has internalized what creates problems. Herman and Chomsky called this flack. The model they described in 1988 has not become less relevant since. The data profile of an average American adult held by major data brokers, companies like Axiom, LexisNexis and Experian, contains on average about 3,000 individual data points. Income range, political affiliation, purchase history, health conditions inferred from what you buy, relationship status, presence of children in the household, magazine subscriptions, charitable donation history, credit score, criminal record, psychological profile built from behavioral patterns over years, most of it collected without your active participation. You didn't fill out a form. You lived your life in a world with loyalty cards, browser tracking cookies, and data sharing agreements between companies you've never heard of. This data is sold to insurance companies, to political campaigns, to employers, to marketers, to collections agencies, to law enforcement in some jurisdictions without a warrant. The phrase, "If you're not paying for the product, you are the product," is attributed to various writers going back to around 2010. It's slightly wrong. You are the product even when you're paying for it. Your bank sells purchase data. So does your pharmacy. So does your grocery loyalty program. The phone in your pocket is a location tracker that also makes calls. In 2018, the New York Times obtained location data from a company that had collected it from apps on millions of phones. The data was marketed as anonymous. The Times mapped one unnamed individual's movements for several months and identified exactly who they were, where they worked, and where they slept. Anonymous location data is not anonymous. A 2013 paper in Nature by Yves Alexandre de Montjoie and colleagues at MIT established that just 12 data points from a location trail are statistically sufficient to uniquely identify a specific person in a dataset of 1.5 million people. 12 points. We've been talking about what external forces do to your mind. Here is something they use that comes from inside you. Stress. Chronic stress shrinks the hippocampus, the part of your brain most critical for forming memories and for flexible, contextual thinking. A 1996 study by J. Douglas Bremner and colleagues measured hippocampal volume in Vietnam veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, and found measurably smaller volumes compared to matched controls without PTSD. You don't need combat trauma to get this effect. Regular chronic stress, job insecurity, financial pressure, relationship conflict, sustained sleep deprivation produces elevated cortisol. Chronic cortisol elevation impairs hippocampal function. You literally remember less. You think less flexibly. Your threat detection system stays hyperactivated. A chronically stressed population is, as a measurable cognitive fact, worse at evaluating information, more responsive to fear-based appeals, and less capable of long-term planning. Economic systems that produce high levels of chronic stress for large portions of their populations produce populations that are cognitively compromised in ways that make them easier to influence. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the measurable outcome of documented biological mechanisms operating on documented economic conditions. Sleep is the other side of the same coin. One night of poor sleep produces cognitive impairment equivalent to a blood alcohol level of 0.05%. That finding comes from a 2000 study by Drew Dawson and Catherine Reed at the University of South Australia. About 35% of American adults sleep less than the recommended 7 hours per night, according to CDC data. 35%. Cognitively impaired. Voting, making financial decisions, consuming news, forming beliefs. Matthew Walker, the neuroscientist at UC Berkeley who published Why We Sleep in 2017, has argued that modern society is running the largest uncontrolled experiment on mass sleep deprivation in human history. Devices in bedrooms extend wakefulness. Blue light from screens delays melatonin release by up to 3 hours, documented across multiple controlled studies. The platforms that keep you scrolling at midnight are the same ones that collected your behavioral profile, built a psychological model of you, and targeted you with content specifically designed to keep you engaged. The loop closes on itself. We've talked about corporations, algorithms, governments, propaganda, unconscious cognition. There is one more category of influence that almost never appears in analyses like this one: the people around you. Your close friends exert an influence on your beliefs, your vocabulary, your political orientation, your health behaviors, and your financial choices that is as powerful as any algorithm. Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler tracked 12,067 people over 32 years as part of the Framingham Heart Study and found the following. If a close friend of yours becomes obese, your own probability of becoming obese increases by 57%. If a friend of your friend becomes obese, someone you may not even know personally, your risk increases by 20%. The same transmission patterns held for smoking cessation, for happiness, for depression, and, in a later follow-up study, for divorce. Social networks are literal contagion systems for behaviors and psychological states. And unlike algorithms, we almost never interrogate the people we trust. We don't think of our closest friends as influence systems, but the mechanism is identical to social proof, conformity pressure, and identity-linked belief formation. The container is different. The cognitive pathway is the same. There is something else that rarely gets said directly. Rational deliberation is metabolically expensive. Roy Baumeister at Florida State published research in 1998 suggesting that willpower depletes with use, a concept he called ego depletion. His specific original findings have faced replication challenges. The effect size in the original papers was likely overstated, but a directional version has survived. Decision fatigue is real. The conditions of your life affect the quality of your thinking, and people who face constant scarcity, stress, and economic pressure show measurable impairments in executive function that have nothing to do with their intelligence. A 2013 paper in Science by Sendil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir found that the cognitive burden of poverty itself, not low intelligence, not cultural factors, just the mental load of managing constant financial scarcity, consumes processing capacity roughly equivalent to losing 13 IQ points. Not the person, the situation. Put the same brain in better conditions and it performs measurably better. This matters for every political and social argument about personal responsibility, rational choice, and individual agency. The conditions in which people make decisions are not neutral, and those conditions are not always chosen. Now comes the part that nobody writing something like this wants to say out loud. This piece, this narration, is itself an attempt to shape how you think, about control, about manipulation, about who does it and how. It has chosen which researchers to cite and which to ignore. It has framed things in a sequence with a direction. It has used emotionally activating examples at specific moments and pulled back to clinical language at others. The structure of the argument leads somewhere. None of that is neutral. Every documentary that tells you about manipulation is itself a form of influence. The correct response to that is not despair and is not cynicism. It's a particular kind of alertness. Psychologist Fernanda Ferreira at UC Davis studies language comprehension and found what she called good enough processing. People don't fully analyze sentences or arguments. They grab the gist, match it to a familiar structure, and move on. You hear something that sounds coherent, matches a narrative pattern you know, comes from a source you've heard of before, and you process it as probably true. That's not stupidity, that's efficiency. It's also the mechanism that every influence operation depends on. What does actual resistance look like? Not skepticism of everything. That produces paralysis, which creates its own vulnerability. A person who trusts nothing will accept the first coherent counter-narrative that arrives. Not trust in nothing. Same outcome through a different route. The answer that appears in the research is more specific. It's called inoculation theory, and it originates in William Maguire's work from the 1960s. Maguire found that if you expose people to a weakened version of a misleading argument, together with a refutation, before they encounter the full version, they show significantly greater resistance to the full version later. Like vaccination. A controlled exposure plus the counter builds resistance. Sander van der Linden at Cambridge University has run inoculation experiments since 2017. One project, a browser game called Bad News, teaches players to recognize specific propaganda techniques by asking them to produce propaganda themselves. Users showed 21% higher resistance to misinformation in subsequent tests. Not perfect, not permanent, but measurable, learnable, lateral reading. This is what professional fact-checkers do when they encounter a source they don't recognize. They don't read the page more carefully. They immediately open new tabs and search for what other sources say about that source. The source's credibility is less important than who vouches for it and who disputes it. A 2019 study from Stanford's History Education Group tested 3 groups on source evaluation: high school students, college students, and professional fact-checkers. The fact-checkers were the only group that used lateral reading consistently. The students evaluated sources by what was on the page itself: the logo, the About section, the professional appearance of the design. Those criteria are nearly worthless as indicators of credibility. Sophisticated disinformation operations often have better graphic design than legitimate news organizations. Professional fact-checkers treated every source as potentially unreliable until confirmed otherwise from external reference points. That's learnable. Here is the last uncomfortable question, and the most important one. Every system of influence described in this piece has specific beneficiaries. The global advertising industry spent approximately $600 billion in 2022, according to Statista data. That is not money spent on things that don't work. Meta's total revenue in 2022 was $116 billion. Alphabet, Google's parent, made $283 billion. The overwhelming majority of that revenue came from selling access to attention and behavioral data to advertisers. Political actors, campaigns, PACs, governments, foreign operations spend enormous and growing sums on voter targeting, opinion research, and influence operations. Data brokers collectively represent an industry estimated at $300 billion annually, according to a 2019 report prepared for the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. None of these industries exist because they're ineffective. They exist because the techniques work. And the techniques work because human cognition has predictable vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities are documented in public academic literature, and the translation from laboratory finding to commercial application has been continuous since at least the 1920s. This is not a new problem. It's an old problem that became vastly more powerful when it acquired digital infrastructure, real-time behavioral data, and the processing capacity to run personalized influence at individual scale simultaneously on billions of people. The people most confident they aren't being influenced are, in the research literature, often the people being influenced most effectively. This is called the third-person effect, first identified by W. Phillips Davison in 1983. People reliably believe that media and persuasion affect other people more than they affect themselves. The more certain you are that you see through manipulation, the less likely you are to take active steps to guard against it, which is obviously useful to know. In 1945, The psychologist Kurt Lewin coined a term while studying something mundane: food supply chains. He was trying to understand who in a household decides which food enters the home and which doesn't. He found that reaching the person who made that decision, the gatekeeper, was far more efficient than trying to reach every household member individually. The concept outlived its original context. Every information system has gatekeepers, editors, algorithms, cultural norms about what's sayable, the economics of which stories get funded and which don't, the social dynamics of which opinions are safe to express in which rooms. You are also a gatekeeper for your own mind and for the people you influence. What comes in, what you pass on, what you say to the people around you. That isn't unlimited. Nothing in this piece suggests your choices are unlimited or even fully yours in any clean philosophical sense. But the space between completely determined and completely free is where real life happens. Benjamin Libet, the same man who found in 1983 that your brain initiates action before you're aware of deciding, spent years after that discovery studying the gap between brain activity and movement. He found something that his critics didn't expect him to find. The unconscious initiation of a movement could still be consciously vetoed. The brain starts the action, but the action can be stopped. Libet called this free won't rather than free will. You may not choose what your brain initiates, but you can sometimes choose not to follow through. That's a smaller and more fragile thing than most people want. It is also real. The question of who controls your mind doesn't have a single answer. It has a list. Your brain's unconscious processes, your history of sleep and stress, the designers of the platforms you use, the company that built and sold your data profile, the political actors who bought access to it, your social network, your childhood, the culture you were born into, the language you think in, which shapes what thoughts are even available to you. And somewhere in that list, smaller than you assumed, but present, you. The question isn't whether influence operates on you. It does. It operates on everyone. The question is whether you know where the levers are. Because once you know where the levers are, you can at least watch for the hand reaching for them. That's not freedom, but it's something.